going to invite or introduce to you first Neil Price, who with over 30 years experience in the arts, health and disability areas, Neil Price undertakes a potted history of the arts and health sector from the 1980s and reflects on his Australia Council Fellowship in 2007 and the establishment of the Creative Ageing Centre. Neil has led a range of projects, including the first non-arts funded artist in residency in Queensland, Creative Noosa Memory Boxes, Morisset Hospital and Lake Macquarie Gallery, the Brisbane Museum and the amazing Remembering Goodna exhibition, and narratives of survivors of sexual abuse and domestic violence. With an extraordinary history and contribution, it's wonderful to have Neil with us. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you for the welcome, and I'd like to recognise the First Nations people and the elders past, present and future. This is a little bit like a trip down memory lane for me. I never throw anything out, so I've been going through old photographs and various things like that, and finding old letters that people wrote me, so it's been a trip into my past. So I've worked for the last 30 years in arts and health, before there was an arts and health sector. And I was a nurse, and I worked in a mental health hospital when I first came to Queensland. And can you do that?
You move it through manually?
I can't.
It's the down button, isn't it?
It is down, correct. Second button. Third button.
Ah, did we get something?
Try now.
Perhaps I'm pointing at wrong. Yeah. No? Okay. Well, okay. So, over a period of 30 years, I went from being a nurse. I'd always been a painter, and I went to art school when I was 16. I was very young, and a glitch in the system in the 70s allowed me to go to Tasmanian School of Art. I wasn't even allowed to go out of the night unaccompanied, and I went to art school when I was 16, and it was an eye-opener, to say the least. And so I became a nurse, because you can't earn money as an artist. And then it wasn't far later that I started seeing opportunities for the arts in health, and especially in mental health. And over the period of 30 years, there's been a number of models that I've started to engage with. I was the first artist in residency in Queensland at a public hospital. There were a couple of others. There was, later on, there was one on the Gold Coast, and there was one in Toowoomba, and there had been one in Melbourne that I knew of in the early days. So we're not getting anywhere. So we've got to go to that. Okay. So I started work at the Winston Noble unit in Chermside at Prince Charles Hospital, and fairly early I presented to them the idea of an artist in residency position. Okay. So one of the so we get the technology now. It's 3 clicks. So. One of the first things we did was during the ECCA, people weren't able to go to the ECCA, so we created our own special ECCA called the SPECCA. And in those days I was working with a friend of Ludmilla's and mine, Richard Benj, had come up from Victoria, and he was working with Access Arts here in Brisbane. And that was a picture of Joe Forsyth, and Steve Kaplan worked on that project, and a number of other people. And we were into rituals, so we built this dragon called Positron, and because it was a psychiatric hospital, Positron went around the hospital and picked up all the negative vibes. And it was a parade, so it took off and Prince Charles Hospital had probably 6,000 people working in it in those days. And it went right around the hospital, the general part, people banging drums, and I was dressed as a clown and all this stuff. And people were asked to write their negative feelings on pieces of paper, and they put them into the mouth of the positron. And later we put them in a fire and we burnt them, and pigeons were released and all sorts of wonderful things happened. Now, this was before there was ever a job description for an artist in healthcare. And so really, I felt like a wizard. I could make up anything and do it. And all this was made out of hospital sheets. So the longer I worked there for 6 years, and I tell you, I must have used 30,000 hospital sheets for banners, you know, all that sort of stuff. So this was the way to go. That was a coloured version of it. So that's the coloured version of it, because in the 1986 we didn't just live in black and white. Colour had come, so we had colour. And I developed a whole lot of events depending on what was going on. So that last one, this one, is Rock and Roll Circus, who you might all remember, came to the hospital for Mental Health Week and spent a day teaching, you know, circus skills to people, and then we had a performance in the afternoon. That's Derek up there, and Rudy, yeah. So this one, this was Easter, and we wanted to develop a new way of delivering Easter eggs to the wards. So we all dressed up as Romans and Palestinians and various other. It's very, very racial when I think about it. And we took off for the afternoon and delivered Easter eggs around the hospital. I mean, you couldn't do this work. You could not do this work now for a whole range of reasons. So this has come out of my deep archive. One of the things I was very proud of is I got into fire as an interest, and it was there was a fire ban. It was very hot in Brisbane. It was a fire ban, and I wanted to do a fire event. I talked to Neil Cameron, I think, at one stage. I said, I'll do fire. No training whatsoever. And this was, we worked with the pastoral care people that they wanted to do some illumination, coming of the light stuff. And so we did a fire event. We got permissions in the middle of a fire ban. We got proper permissions to do a fire event in a public Queensland hospital, which you could not do. I wouldn't give permission to it, but we did it. So this was it. And really, it was a way of inviting people into the hospital. One of the basic ideas of my work is to try and cut down the barriers between hospital life and community life. So we have many examples in Queensland and in other states where hospitals have failed. You know, the people have died, been neglected. There's a recent one in Adelaide called Oakden, which was a huge fail. People lost, were just neglected, and they eventually closed that facility down. And one of the ideas, when I was working here, Townsville 10B had been an issue. It was where over 300 people had lost their lives through over-medication and various other things at the hands of health professionals. So, I'm not painting them as being angels, because there's some big fails in hospitals. And this work was really about more transparency in hospitals, more choices for patients. In these days, people in a mental health institution, which this was, didn't have a lot of choices. And you could be signed in there, and little by little by little, your choices would diminish. And often when you're discharged, they don't give you choice back. There's lots of conditions when you're discharged. So this was a way of getting the community into the actual site, and by doing events. And all my events were open invitation to community members, family, people like that. I will try and move on. So I'll move fast through this. So in 2007, I got an Australia Council Fellowship to work with consumers of mental health and care organisations. I'd been later on. I became the executive director of Access Arts when I worked with people with disability, and through that, I started hearing stories about living in what was called the Spastic Centre. So these are really almost ancient ideas now, but in these days they needed shaking up. There was a lot of that to do. And I spent 2 years doing digital stories and capturing stories of people who'd survived institutional care. As part of that, I started working with seniors here in the Noosa Shire, and I started working with memory boxes and reminiscence work. I'll go through this fairly quickly because I understand we are on a schedule. But basically it was a way of engaging with seniors to tell any story that they wanted to tell about their life's achievement. This was Juliet, who had run the Noosa Cafe in the days when surfers came up from Brisbane, and there was a little cafe, and her and her husband, George, ran this cafe, and they made a little memory box. They recreated the memory box, and we recorded a lot of that on footage. People were interviewed and told their stories with their memory box using old photographs and things like that. And it's completely engaging work. If you're ever wanting to get into a line of work that's interesting, it's completely engaging because of who you're working with, and you'll always find stories that are amazing. This was Eve's box, and she did a memory box about her father, who was a boat builder. So people had the choice of whatever story they wanted to tell. School was a big one for people. They wanted to talk about their first day at school, and this box became a tabletop. He just kept building and building and building, and so it wasn't a box anymore. No, nothing's working. Oh, there we go. I'll keep going through those. Also, a lot of immigration stories. The news gives us a diet of immigration. Is it good? Is it bad? But we've had immigration in this country for a very long time. And in these groups, a lot of 10-pound poms, what was called the 10-pound poms, brought their passports and photos of the boats they came to Australia on, and talked about the life that they established here. So those stories are very important in terms of cultural identity. This is a story about a man who lived in Gympie, and his parents had 10 children in a one-bedroom house with a piano. And it was really iconic. The attention to detail in this, he made family portraits, and these boxes often take 5 or 6 weeks to make over a period of time. So they become cherished items, and people pass them on to their families. So they're not all sad. They're not. With memories, you've got to balance. Sometimes it's quite sad, poignant stories. Part of my fellowship, I worked with the Lake Macquarie Art Gallery and Morisset Hospital. Now, Morisset Hospital is one of the old, very frightening institutions. In the day, there were several hospitals you never wanted to go to. Morisset was one of them. It's somewhat changed now, but I worked with people in Morisset Hospital and 2 artists and the gallery. And when you're in hospital, sorry, go back. Tricky. Okay, that'll come good. When you're in hospital, you're often not allowed to have scissors or cutlery, or in a mental health hospital, not allowed to have anything really. And with this, the 2 artists we employed, one was a welder, and so started to talk about what would a project look like, and they decided to build a carousel. And the other artist was a sound artist, and she made a a musical track that happened with the carousel when it went around. You know, people had spent weeks drumming and playing teacups and various other things. And so this carousel, which was placed in the exhibition called Stop the World, I Want to Get Off, became a centrepiece. And each person made things that they were interested in. So one man loved watching horror movies, and he'd watched a horror movie about hornets invading, the world. And part of this work is really drawing out whatever it is you need to draw out in a community. It's not my decision what happens. And one of the wonderful things about the work is you wouldn't know what was going to happen. You know, there's so much goes on. And it's all very much dependent on the participants. Another man liked watching Roman movies, especially religious Easter movies, and he made himself a Roman helmet, which he got to take home and, use, I guess. But they were elaborately made and beautifully made by people. Sometimes there were sort of Viking ships and mythological animals. And we took some of the furniture from the hospital and put it in the gallery. And you'll see, what a lovely seat, but it was in a hospital, which wasn't a great place. And so these seats accompanied the exhibition, and participants had made 2 guardians out of wire and various other things. We didn't have a lot of materials, and these guardians sat and watched and looked after the exhibition. But the Lake Macquarie Gallery had been, the Lake Macquarie Gallery had been a very, what is called sort of high culture, and so for them to work with a community group, they were very pleased with those outcomes. I'll go very quickly now. Goodna was another mental health hospital that I worked in, and I helped the Brisbane Museum staff curate an exhibition on the history of Goodna, or Wacol Hospital, I think it was called. I'll go through this pretty quickly. I'll get to this one. So often those histories have very grim pasts, and what was the responsibility of the staff in the museum was they were bringing 2 lots of people together. They were bringing staff who'd worked in that place for a long period of time, and they also brought consumers, mental health consumers, who had not had a good experience. And so one of the most remarkable things about this exhibition is how they managed bringing those 2 cohorts of people together in a safe environment. And a lot of this work, you need to think very clearly about the protocols of working with people who've had trauma and experienced trauma. One of the things, and I will move very quickly if I can get these slides to go. One of the things I was asked to do was to, because I was doing a lot of memory boxes around town at that time with various groups, I did an exhibition called First Aid Kit, and rather than being a memory box, it was a box of resilience. What were the qualities that helped you be resilient in this place? I'll just show you one. I'll get to one. So this, for example, these were accompanied with sort of written stories and also video stories. Some of them, I think, Hamish, who works here, did some audio stories, which are still online if you go to A Place to Belong. Those stories are still online. Often there were things that people said that gave you the kernel of the story. And this one was, I knitted under the light of an exit sign at night, making blankets for my children. It was a way of keeping in touch. And these stories are around people who've been institutionalised. This lady was institutionalised in hospital for 6 years. She did not come out and see her family for 6 years. So this was the gathering. I'll kind of conclude at the end of this, but this was bringing those lots of people together. And some of those people, some people didn't want to see people from the past. So there was lots of social kind of protocols we had to manage to get that to happen in a safe environment, and so that people wouldn't be traumatised further. The staff of the museum stayed in touch with some of the consumers on this project for over 2 years as a way of ensuring kind of trust, really, that trust was maintained. I won't go through these, actually. I'll skip very closely to these. Okay, and I'll just end on this note, if I can. So
at that point, I'll have a check.
It's all right. No, it's all right. I'll just leave this one. So one of the things I'm interested in now, I run the Creative Ageing Centre. I turned 64 a week ago. It was a big shock to me. I thought, my heroes were Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. They both went at 27. So 64, I'm not doing that well, But I do a lot of this work now. I went to London and I trained as a reminiscence therapist. And so I work on projects with the Palliative Care Queensland. And these are from survivors of World War II. It was a European project, but they did them in old ammunition cases. And it's a very famous project that toured around Europe in, I think, 90s. But beautiful work. They're accompanied by publications and stories. And to conclude, it's those opportunities, and I enjoyed the idea about what does the future hold and where to from now. I think there's still huge opportunities for people to work in health and aged care, health and the arts and healthcare. When I started, there was no roadmap. As I said, I made up the rules as I went. I learned how to write strategic documents. I learned how to write proposals. All of that stuff came and gave me a career, really. But if you're a newcomer, and it's important that we reach out to newcomers and emerging artists, we've all finished our working life. If you're over 60, it's the pointy end of our working life, as it should be, I think, although I plan to go a little longer. But if you're new and you're coming in, grab a mentor, find someone working in the sector, grab a mentor and find ways of meeting people. Get those networks going yourself. There's plenty of networks out there if you know where to look, but find someone who does know, and they'll head you off in the right direction, because there's still lots of opportunities. Children, all that sort of child abuse stuff that's gone on. There's young people are still vulnerable, old people are still vulnerable. There's a lot that, aged care needs a good shake-up. So there's thousands of opportunities in aged care to work. Go in, get people's stories, empower people, by storytelling, by painting, by dancing. You'll hear lots more about what's happening in aged care later today. So thanks for being here. I'll conclude on that. Thank you.